One area where you can find some real improvements, especially if you play in games where there are a lot of multi-way limped pots, is by thinking about leading in those pots, especially in free play situations from the big blind. Without further ado, let's look at a hand where we go through exactly a situation like that. Good morning, how are we doing today? My name is James Sweeney, aka SplitSuit. Welcome back to another video. And today we're going to review a hand sent in by BPR. This was posted on the Red Chip Poker Discord. You can always join over there today for free at redchippoker.com/discord. It'll take you right over there. But without further ado, let's look at this 10 no limit hand. There's a limp for middle position, the small blind completes, and hero decides to check. And honestly, this is a totally standard check. There's really no other option here. Raising makes no sense, not going to fold, so just check your option and go to the flop. And here we go, small blind checks, hero decides to check, and let's back up a tick and talk about this spot. So just in general, we definitely want to consider leading in these kind of situations, these multi-way limped pots where we catch some sort of equity. Leading makes a lot of sense and should definitely be a consideration. Not saying you do it 100% of the time, but even in a heads-up limped pot, it's still something you should be doing a decent chunk of the time when you flop equity. And this is mostly because it's not a situation where there's a pre-flop raise, right? There's no pre-flop raiser, there's no check to the raiser kind of thought process, and as such, leading can make a lot of sense. Again, when you pick up some chunk of equity, even though you won't improve a ton of the time on the turn. In this situation though, with a two-way straight draw, it's not too bad. The issue though is that we have the butt side of the straight draw, right? A made straight could already be made right this moment that's higher than ours. If an 8 pops on the board, that's not really a great thing for us, even though it does give us a straight, and being dominated is actually a very, very serious thing that you want to consider when it comes to how big of a pot do I want to create. Now, that's not to say that there isn't some value in building big pots with dominated draws. The GTO solvers can prefer that in certain situations, but unless our opponents are extremely good, and you could definitely make an argument that maybe middle position, who is open limping from middle position, maybe isn't exactly that, we can likely improve on the GTO approach by only building big pots with things like strong draws or stronger made hands, not really having to get into this, get closer to the solver approach in this exact scenario. So again, we could probably improve on that by looking at something like not building a massive pot, and check raising is one of the things that's going to do that, and that's actually the line that hero decides to take in this spot. Ends up check raising against an MP bet and a small blind call, and this just again is building a massive pot with a very dominated draw, could already be massively behind totally right this moment, and it's just one of those where I don't really like the check raise. So if we go back to the original flop inflection point, I don't love check raise. Check call is totally fine. It's a valid approach, especially if you're facing a smaller bet. And leading is also very, very good too. And again, most people will just totally take leading right off the table, won't even consider it. But this is a spot where I'm encouraging you to really consider looking at leading in these multi-way pots where you pick up some equity, be it a draw, be it a pair, whatever it is. And in this situation, I think leading is going to be better, and most certainly going to be better than going for the check raise that hero went for. Now, as it runs out, we end up getting a call for middle position, fold by small blind. Turn, we end up improving to a straight, which is always nice, but again, we still have to consider that we are going to be behind a chunk of the time. There are made straights that are higher than ours right this moment, and of course, equity that our opponent could have as well, so something to keep in mind. I'm not really looking to play for stacks at this stage in the game, especially just given the way the board is. Is my opponent really going to take 2 pair and just completely bomb off on a 4 straight board? I'm not incredibly convinced that that's going to be the case, even only at 10 no limit. So as played, here does decide to continue firing, fires for fairly large into the pot, not quite pot, but a little under it. And this is one where I would definitely consider going a little bit smaller. Again, I'm not really looking to play for stacks. I definitely still like to charge my opponent. I think there is definitely some stuff that will continue, and even more so as the bet size gets a little bit smaller, maybe closer to half pots. I think that's going to perform better, gets more second best continuance from our opponent, and also keeps us away from building an all-in pot, which again, bigger bets just get us closer and closer to that point, especially with a little bit of extra depth against our opponent. So as played, our opponent does decide to call. River is the 7, pairs that top card, and at this stage in the game, hero decides to check. Now, if we back up a tick, we essentially have 2 major options here, in my opinion. Option number 1 is we can go for a smaller value bet on the river, and probably something like the $1.60 to $1.75 range, and that's going to be just fine. And obviously your thought process there is trying to get called by those second best hands that would otherwise maybe check behind, like 6x or even 7x against some players, pocket 8s, things like that. So you're really trying to get looked up by those, and the smaller bet is going to encourage them to continue more liberally, and you're probably not going to get bluff raised hardly ever, just again considering we're playing 10 no limit. The other option is to check like Hero did and plan on check calling. And the reason is that when you're thinking about recreational players and micro players in general, they tend to bet too wide on rivers, even with kind of medium strength hands. So it's just one of those where I think it makes a lot more sense to check call than it would definitely to check raise. And I don't really see much reason to check fold. Again, assuming your read is correct in the player pool, there's going to be a lot more medium strength incorrect betting on the river. And as such, you should be calling here with this bottom side straight. So let's just play it out. So as played, Hero does end up calling. Unfortunately, top 2 on the flop does end up improving to that boat on the river, and Hero ends up losing. It is what it is. But it's really important to think about what happened here. We noticed that Hero got involved in a pot size that was just way too big for his hand and the goals of that hand, right? If we think about even going back to the flop, we went for a check raise, which just creates a much bigger pot than if we had just let it in general. Going to the turn, we made a bet that was bigger than we suggested, and on the river, again, we're in a situation where had we bet the smaller bet on the river, we would have had more control, we would have generated a pot size that was more in line with what our overall goals are. Again, all this barring having any information or reads on our opponent, which I don't believe we had. So this is just the kind of spot where, unfortunately, Hero's overall plan of attack created a situation where the pot was way too big, and now we're left scrambling, whereas had we controlled a little bit better, things would have been much better off for Hero, and even more so had we consider leading on the flop instead of just going for a typical check. Again, most players don't even consider it, but I would highly suggest you do, especially in these multi-way limped pots where you flop some sort of draw or equity. It can be very viable to go for that flop lead instead, and unfortunately might not have necessarily gotten away from this. You may have lost some money on it, but I don't think it runs out the exact same way, and the pot size I think is going to be much smaller had we gone that way, which could be good. Unfortunately, we end up running into a setup spot like this. And by the way, if you want to continue working on your post-flop game, I would definitely suggest checking out my post-flop workbook. It's the exact kind of work and exercises I've done over the years between sessions to make sure that when I look at a spot like this that's very mathematical, very technical, that it sets me up for success. Things like check raising, things like Hero calling rivers, things like finding thinner value bets, all of this is covered in the post-flop workbook. You can get your copy today at splitsuit.com/postflop. Do a few pages per day. You get through it in a little bit of time, and it's going to help you a tremendous amount at looking at this very complex game at a much more technical level and allow you to make much better decisions at the table. And with that said, that's going to wrap up this video. Thank you so much, BPR, for sending this hand in, and if you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them down below, and a thumbs up if you enjoyed this video would be massively appreciated. If you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you back soon with a brand new video. In the meantime, good luck out there and happy grinding.